Okay? So whatever we put in there is going to affect everything down here. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay? So, let me just kind of just take this for just a case in point here. So, for the example that's here in that column, we've got a $100,000 loan at 10% for 30 years. Monthly payments are $877.57. Everybody cool with that? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So you look down here at our loan amortization calculator, and this is going to frighten some of you, but halfway through that loan, which is 15 years into it, we have already paid $139,627.45 of interest. We have only paid back, after 15 years, we have only paid back $18,000 of that $100,000 loan. Meaning we still owe, as you can see there, $81,664. Okay? Is that not disturbing?
It is.
And it's because of, once again, how interest is calculated. Okay? And so the total, we've already paid for that loan $157,000 total of actual out-of-pocket dollars. Okay? So, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to figure out those numbers for any particular period of time. So let's go over here, and we're going to use a function called cumulative interest. C-U-M-I-P-M-T. Okay? C-U-M-I-P-M-T. All right? Again, C-U-M-I-P-M-T. All right? Now, the first thing, just like all the other sort of functions, it asks for, okay, what is the rate? Okay? So we're going to go up. Same thing we've done before. In this case, oops, wrong column. Okay, take column or cell E9, divide it by E5, comma, and then the number of periods is going to be the 30 or E8 times E5 to 12, comma, then the present value of the loan, which is $100,000, comma, start period, which is going to be the cell right up here with the 1 in it, the cell F18, or F9, yeah, F19, I'm sorry, comma, F20 is going to be the ending period, comma, and then the type, we're going to go back up, capture, oops, the 0 over in cell E14. Now, hopefully we've done everything correct. Yay, matched up.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit.
I have a quick question. This is using the payment column. Is it always going to be the payment column, or is that just specific
I did
to
that
this?
just because I thought it was the most logical column to use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was trying to, instead of having to put this on multiple sheets of paper, I was just trying to consolidate stuff.
Yeah.
30.
Okay, so maybe, there's the formula.
Once you change that, then we do it. You have to change up time. Yeah. 12 or 60.
This should be 360 because this is 4.5, right? So this should be 10%. This should be 12, right?
No, 30.
30. And this should be 6.7. So it should be
Just write it down, 360.
This?
Yeah. And now the in cell 7.5
But
million.
it doesn't have that.
Okay, everybody got it?
Doesn't matter. Right here.
All right.
100,000.
So, just using pure logic,
And now you go from
what's the function going to be for the cumulative principal?
Cum prince.
Probably so. P R-I-N-C. Okay? Okay, see if you can fill it in basically the same way you did the other one, on your own.
But the formula IPNT is for principal reduction, right? Am I?
Yeah, for the interest payment only, for a specific month.
Okay.
Whereas cumulative interest calculates over a period of time.
But before this? Over here, I think something wrong. Maybe I don't have any formula.
No, just copy from here. You just
No, you have to put the equal first. So now, then you can make it a formula.
Yeah, but if I don't have the numbers here correct, I don't think it'll work.
Yeah, it's correct. It's right, it is the same.
What?
Yeah, the equal in front of the
In front of the
Cumulative payment, just like it is on the screen.
equal. CUM, IPNT. Now you do the same formula as before. 10%.
Okay,
That one.
hopefully you figured out the cumulative principal, so let's just take a look. We're gonna go up, we can scroll, we're just gonna get the rate.
What's the
Divided,
difference between this and that?
because here it's
Divided
using
by-
PNT column number, so it has to be used this one.
Oh,
Divided by 12.
Comma,
Comma.
Want me to read mine out?
30
Hume print.
times 12.
E9 divided by E5,
30.
comma, E5 times E8, comma, E10,
Comma.
And
F19.
now you just take the number
20.
that
Yeah,
tells you.
TV,
present
then I
value,
put 100,000.
comma,
F20, or F19.
Start period.
start, comma, end, comma,
Right here, it's like
Just put that in.
Teacher's
number 1.
And period. Close parentheses.
No,
tiny
then
thing.
close it.
That'd be
You have to put
Okay.
the type.
And then you gotta go back.
everybody match up?
Put the type.
Okay, once again, pop it up there.
That's comma.
The type.
Type is right here. 0. No, that one. This one. You have to say on the PNT column. Are you close it?
You have entered too few arguments for this function. Nice.
All right. Now, who can figure out how to calculate the total paid? Add them together. Okay, so total paid is simply going to be adding F22
F20,
plus F23,
F20.
boom.
Another
Okay?
and F20.
Now,
Yeah, correct.
Professor Forgy, the
Right?
cumulative
Comma.
principal is the equity that
Comma,
gets
but
built
the
up
type. You have
in
to
the
write
property,
type.
right?
During that period of time.
And then you can refinance it or get an equity line.
Right. But it's, here's the thing, okay, so just keep in mind, that was for half of the loan. For the whole loan, it would be 360 months. So it's a good way to check and see if you did everything correct. So for 360 months, the full loan term, you pay back the full $100,000 of your loan. You pay $215,000 in interest. Your total out of pocket, obviously adding those two together, is $315,000, all right? Does that make sense, everybody? Yes, no, possibly could be. All right? Now, but here's the thing. One of the things that we currently benefit from with our income tax laws, which is all going to be changing, hopefully, is the mortgage interest deduction. Okay? So for residential, your own personal properties as well as investment properties, one of the things that you get to deduct is the mortgage interest off of those properties, okay? Well, in order to fill out your tax forms, you've got to figure out how much mortgage interest did I pay. Now, usually your lender will send you a statement that already has that calculated for you, but if you have self-financed or financed with, individuals, you're gonna have to calculate it on your own, all right? So in this particular case, we can simply say, okay, I wanna know for the first 12 months that I own this property, how much interest did I have that I can potentially deduct from my income taxes? Well, there it is, $99.74.88, okay? And sadly, during that first year, I only paid back $555 of the loan. All the rest went to interest. Okay, does everybody follow on that? Now, here's the thing. What if I wanted to know specifically for like a year other than year one? Maybe I wanted to know year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. Okay, so for year 2, what is it going to be? What months?
24.
13 to 24. Think about that for a second. Month 13 is January of the second year. Month 12 is December of the first year. Does everybody follow that? Mm-hmm. So month 24 is December of the second year. Okay? Now this is just one of those things that you need to get this sort of stuff kind of committed to memory. Specifically, no word right. All right, so year 1, we said, is months 1 to 12. Year 2 is 13 to 24. Year 3 would be 25 to 36. Year 4 would be 37 to 48. Year 5 would be 49 to 60. Year 6 would be 61 to 72, and so forth, so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? So, if I were to ask you on a quiz, tell me what is the total interest paid during year 3? What months would I use?
25 to 36.
And there you are. Make sense? Nice warm fuzzy feelings? Okay. All right. Okay, we'll go back and put those back at where they were, 1 and 180. So we keep all the numbers right. Okay. Balance at the end of the period. Any idea of what we might use for this?
100,000 minus the
Not
principal.
present value,
Future value?
future value.
Yeah, because it's the end.
Equal future value. Okay. We've already done a future value up above, but this one's different because we're changing up what? The term. Okay? So in this case, future value, the rate, yeah, we're going to have to go, let me kind of,
So now,
let me zoom out a little bit so I can see what I'm doing.
10% divided by 12.
Okay.
Is n times
So future value, open parentheses, the rate, 10% divided by 12 months, comma, number of periods. Now, at this particular point, the number of periods is going to be what? 180, or that cell reference for 180. Right there, F20. Comma, the payment, we'll capture it, comma, the present value, capture it, comma, and then the type. Oops, did something by accident there.
the type is 0. I mean,
Type is 0, yep.
14.
zoom out. Okay.
But that, why the F20?
Because the end period that we're calculating for the amortization calculator is we're saying we want to know what the balance is at the end of month 180. In other words, what we're telling Excel, the rate, the 10% divided by 12, but the term of what we have paid, only of what we have paid, has been 180. Okay? Regardless of the fact that the loan is for 360 months, what we have paid has been 180 payments. That's the reason there's a balance, because we haven't paid 360. Let me show you something. Okay?
Wasn't easy to put just the cumulative principal, the PV minus the
You
cumulative.
could. Just a different way of doing it.
That's why I was explaining.
But if you did it that way, the problem with that is if you do an intervening time period, it's only going to capture the principal paid during that time period.
If you're adding a 13.
Okay? All right. So let's just show you something. I think this will help answer your question. Okay? So without me punching it in, what's going to happen if I type in 360 as the end period? What is going to be the balance?
0.
Should be 0. Because the loan's paid off after 360 months. Okay? If we type in, let's say, just for fun, the previous month, 359. Okay? So at month 359, we still owe
The month of them?
$870, and about $6.70 of that is interest. Okay, make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just put that back at 180. Okay, do we match up? Okay, everybody cool, comfortable? All right.
You know how to hold this one?
No.
It's, soon. You add this to
Some.
Okay. On this little spreadsheet, the last little thing that we've got here is the effective interest rate calculator. So this is something that in the finance class we were actually talking a little bit about today. And that is, what is your effective interest rate assuming different compounding periods? Okay? So in this case, if we've got 12 compounding periods, meaning monthly compounding, and we have a stated or nominal interest rate of 10%, what does that mean our effective interest rate is going to be? Well, let's just show this on the calculator first.
1.2%. I got it.
Okay, so for that setup,
I'm gonna make it okay.
we would have 12 payments per year.
I'm going to start.
Okay, and then we would put in 10 shift nominal percent. Okay, look underneath the interest rate key on the calculator. What does it say? NOM, percent. Okay, then you would simply just solve for the effective rate. It's shift effective
Which is under
percent, which is right underneath the present value key, okay? So in doing that, let's just see what it tells us.
147.
Are you all right, man? Probably
All right.
10.14.
10.47, excuse me, 10.471306, okay, as the effective percent, all right? So now, we're gonna do this on Excel. This is not an actual function, at least not the way that I'm doing it. It's not an actual function. We're gonna do it real simply, sort of by formula, okay? And why don't you tinker around with it just for a second on your own and see if you can figure it out. Matter of fact, if you've got the textbook, it shows you how to do it. The formula to kind of help you out a little bit. You're basically going to take the nominal percent, okay, and you are going to add to that 0.10, and then you're going to raise that to the power of 12 and divide that by 12. That's all you're doing. So see if you can figure it out.
I think it's easier to use the effect formula. But
Oh, I got 26.15.
Picture. Just click the.
Okay, there we go. Got it.
Difference. Here and there.
So,
Somewhere.
there it is.
There's an easy way. Ready? Just clear. Exit. Type in EF. Effect. Click it. Double click. There you go. Click 10%.
Where's the?
12. Or the, click at the cell.
Board is not -1.
Oh, I'm sorry?
End parentheses.
Board does not have -1.
Right
Oh.
there. Boom.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't.
Much easier. See, once you see how it's done. Or the, like, equation, if you were to do it. It's gonna be all be done. And you're out.
Okay, you got it? Okay, so let's play around with this just for a second. So just to make sure that everything's working, let's say that we change the compounding periods to 1. It should be the same. Okay? 1 compounding period,
Yeah.
annual compounding, the effective rate and the nominal rate are the same. Okay, change it to 2 compounding periods. Okay, 3, 4, 6. What about daily compounding, 365? Or, put a really large number there, almost continuous compounding. Okay,
512.
all right. We good? Okay, so, now we've gone through putting in, obviously, the different values, and kind of talking through the different values. What I want to do now is spend a little bit of time going back, now that we've done everything, in the sense of what we've set out to do with regard to the formulas. Okay? Are there any bits and pieces of this, for whatever reason, that don't make sense to you? That now is the time to get those questions out. So like, speak now or forever hold your peace. what I don't want are a bunch of emails and a bunch of phone calls and a bunch of visits. I would rather get the questions out now. Yes?
Why the -1 on that last formula?
Okay. So the question was, okay, so why on this do we have to have the -1? Well, if we take away the -1, it basically gives us 110%. Well, mathematically, what we have to do up front, whenever we're doing these calculations, we've got to add 1 up here to the front in order to raise it to the exponent. And to basically remove that, once we've got it there, is we're just subtracting it out. That's basically all we're doing. Yep.
Can you give us an example of using net present value to compare two properties?
Sure.
And then that's where I struggle in other classes.
Okay. It's an excellent question. So let's do this on an annual basis. Compare two properties side by side. Okay, so let's do this. Let's take, and I'm going to try to highlight everything here. Okay, so the question that Gayon asked is, all right, let's say that we want to compare two properties side by side using net present value and internal rate of return. All right, and so let's start with the assumption, for the moment, they both have the same purchase price. Okay, but their cash flow streams are going to be different in some way. All right, and this is an example that, actually, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is something that I think it's like a fundamental sort of way of thinking about investing in real estate. And specifically, would you prefer to be a slumlord, or would you prefer to be what I would call an overly conscientious investor? Those are two extremes. Now let me explain what I think the two mean, and when we're comparing. But in other words, on one side, we've got, I'm just going to, we'll go ahead and type it in up here. Slumlord. Okay. Over here, overly, if I can spell it right, but let's just say overly
Careful.
careful. Good.
Meticulous.
Meticulous. All right.
How you spell that?
So what I mean by the slumlord, if you think about it, the slumlord is the type of person, like, buy a property, and their whole investment strategy is to spend as little money as possible while they own the property, try to absorb as much operating income as they possibly can while they own the property. Now, chances are, during that ownership period, the property probably deteriorates physically because they're not maintaining it, they're not doing routine maintenance. But then ultimately, you know, after, let's say, 5 years, their strategy might just be, all right, at the end of that 5-year period, I'm going to sell it for whatever I can sell it for, right? Now, in many cases, slumlords tend to own it forever, but we're going to put a defining moment on this. They're going to have to sell it after 5 years. Whereas the overly conscientious, or what we call an overly careful sort of investor, the polar opposite of the slumlord, is somebody who buys a property and they feel like, for whatever reason, they need to attend to every possible conceivable need that a tenant may have, or that the property may have, that so much as a scuff mark on the wall, it's going to be gone within 24 hours. You know, If somebody spills something on the carpet, they're going to have it replaced within, 24 hours. If, I mean, that level of attention. I'm not saying it's all bad. I mean, it's great if you're a tenant, but spending that amount of money potentially on maintaining the property at literally, the highest possible conceivable level is not cheap, and it's going to have an impact on your cash flow. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, so those are two extremes, as I'm going to call them. Now, you think about this, and initially, the property starts off in both instances, same property, identical, everything is good, okay? Everything is new. So, on an annual basis, let's say that the property generates $150,000 of net operating income a year. Okay? Now, in essence, we could kind of come in here. Initially, we might say, okay, 150,000. Over here, let's say 150,000, just for the moment. But what we're actually sort of beginning to now say is, all right, of that income, how much are we spending on maintenance and repairs? Okay, we can sort of back up from that and sort of say, all right, that let's just say that the average person, average owner, would spend 150. Okay, so somewhere in between these two folks. Okay, the slumlord is probably going to figure out ways to cut out some operating expenses. Okay, so they may be able to, in essence, inflate that number to, let's say, 175. Okay? On the flip side, the overly careful person or the overly conscientious sort of investor is going to inflate the operating expenses to where this number is going to go down. In other words, they're going to be just finding anything they possibly can to fix on the property. All right? So that might go down to, let's say, I don't know, 125. Okay, does that make sense, what I'm sort of suggesting? All right? So let's say that we do that for 5 years, in both instances. 175. Oops. And 125. Okay, but that's not the end of the story, okay? In this case, we're still both in negative cash flow territory. The reason is we haven't factored in a resale price, okay? And that's where it begins to get really interesting really quickly, okay? Because fundamentally, what drives the value of a property? For those of you that were in my class this morning, what fundamentally drives the value of the property? Net operating income. What has the slumlord done? They have a much higher NOI, don't they? But, whenever somebody comes and they do a property inspection, they're going to say, yeah, you've been generating $175,000 a year for the past 5 years, but the deferred maintenance on this property is ridiculous, okay? And so they're going to probably make something of a downward adjustment. In other words, they're going to probably apply a much higher cap rate to the property simply because of the quality and the state in which it's in. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
So the cap rate that they apply is not determined like based on the market or anything. It's basically.
It's going to be a property-specific cap rate because they're going to say the condition of this property is not normal.
Okay, so
It's below normal. Therefore, the cap rate's going to be higher. All right? And then on the other side, they may actually say, once again, it's not normal as well. It's, this property has been maintained to a gold standard. There's no depreciation, you know, everything is amazing. Okay? So, but let's just kind of, you know, and just in very simple terms, I mean, look at the purchase price. Let's just kind of use this as kind of a baseline. The original purchase price for both was $1 million. So the expectation would be if you had a normal owner, they should be able to sell it for at least what they paid for it. Probably, yes? Okay, and with a little bit of increase, okay? So let's just, for fun, let's just say that in both instances, we actually keep it at $1 million. So we're just going to add $1 million. So in other words, we're reselling the property at the end of 5 years for $1 million plus the final year cash flow. All right, so what does that do to us? Well, in this case, we get a 17.5% return as the slumlord. In this case, we're only getting a 12.5% return as the conscientious investor. Okay, now what one would hope in terms of market realities would be, well, this number might get knocked down a little bit from that $1 million mark to maybe, I don't know, let's just say we take 175,000 off of it, we just get back 1 million. And then over here, we sort of say, okay, well that final year, we take and we add maybe another 125,000, so 1,250,000. So we've added a little bit here, we've taken away a little bit here. We're getting pretty darn close to the same returns. Yes? In terms of the internal rate of return, 14.9 versus 14.38. So if we just simply take this, just once again, you know, this is not obviously absolute numbers, but the point is, under this scenario, we would be inclined to say it pays more to be a slumlord. With the assumptions that we've made, you know. Now, you've got to sort of say, well, at some point, you know, how low would we have to go? If we went down to 900,000, okay, that's low enough with the resale price and last year's cash flow to actually show that our percentage is lower than the overly careful investor. Does that make sense? So the whole idea of what I'm trying to get you to sort of think about is that it's not absolute that one of these two extreme strategies is going to be, under all circumstances and conditions, better than the other. It really, you know, it depends on, you know, there could be other intervening factors, like the market itself has gone up in such a rapid pace that the fact that the property is a piece of junk now because it's been run into the ground may not matter that much because it's really the land value that's driving the property, okay? You know, whereas on the other side, you know, it could be, once again, you know, this overly conscientious investor or you know, that they put so much money into this that it just doesn't make any sense, you know, in terms of the rate of return that they're able to generate because it's substantially below what maybe other similar properties are generating. And they're never going to maybe be able to realize the full value of it because they're over fixing everything. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if we sort of flow on down a little bit more, and we look at the discount rate and we kind of look at what the NPV is, then, you know, here what we're basically saying is if our hurdle rate, and this is a key word to use, hurdle rate. It means the rate that we've got to jump over, okay? Just like a hurdle in a race, okay? So the hurdle rate is that bottom threshold number that we have personally set as an investor, owner, operator, whatever it might be, for us to own and operate a property. Now, 5% is pretty low. I would argue, let's say, maybe let's raise that a little bit, I don't know, to 10%.
What does that mean?
15%.
What does the discount rate mean? I mean,
It just simply means that is the minimum rate that we desire as the owner of the property
okay.
in order for us to feel as though we have been adequately compensated for the risk and for everything that we've undertaken with respect to this property. Now, once again, it's different from one person to the next. You know,
Could it
so-
be called management fee?
No, it's not a management fee. Management fee is a totally different thing. Management fee is simply an operations sort of fee. This is dealing with, I've got $100. I want to put that $100 into a real estate investment.
Correct.
I demand that at the end of the year, I get paid $15 of interest or on that $100, 15% rate of return.
Okay.
Okay? Anything less than 15%,
Not acceptable.
I'm not happy.
Right.
Okay? So that's your hurdle rate. I've set the hurdle rate now to 15%. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, now. This is a good thing to sort of illustrate here. The property, under these conditions, right now, is generating a 13.28% return. Does that meet my hurdle rate? Yes or no?
No.
No. Well, that obviously is shown down here because now I've got a negative net present value. So what that's saying is that I am not meeting my hurdle rate, and in fact, I'm about $52,000 shy in terms of income in order to meet that hurdle rate of 15%. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so now,
All you have to do is add 60,000 up top.
yeah, if we add some more money up top, that can all change. But if we also just sort of say, well, maybe our hurdle rate is too high at 15%, maybe we should make it 12%. Okay, and if we're happy with 12%, then what we're now saying is, okay, we're still generating a 13% return there and a 14% return there, but we've set our new threshold as an investor for 12%. We have jumped over that hurdle of 12%, and we are generating positive extra cash flow above the 12% of 42,000. Now, this is the part that hopefully, if that doesn't quite make it sink in, this next piece will. What if I were to make the discount rate 13.28%? Without pushing the enter key, what's going to happen? Pretty darn close to break even, okay? Because that's, in essence, and the only reason it's not precisely is, once again, is rounding, okay? But in other words, by putting in the exact return that we are receiving on the two properties as our discount rate, that means that our net present value should be pretty darn close to zero. It should be exactly zero, but it's not because of rounding, okay? Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay? So in this particular case, what we're saying is, okay, we have come within $4 of precisely meeting our hurdle rate or our discount rate of 13.28%. Matter of fact, if we were to change it just ever so slightly to 13.27, just to sort of show, then yeah, see right there, and 14.37. Okay? Because now we're ever so slightly below that hurdle rate, or we're ever so slightly above the hurdle rate with our internal rate of return, therefore we are generating a minuscule sort of dollar return beyond the required hurdle rate. Here's what you gotta kind of put into your head. It's kind of like saying, all right, I demanded that, whatever it was, 15% rate of return. And then after I've paid you the $15, then I've got a few extra dollars that the project actually earned that I can throw in your direction. And that is kind of your net present value. The term net present value implies that you've got to subtract out the original investment to figure out what you have left over.
Is there, like, let's say for a more simple equation, is there a way to set what your net present value is in this equation and kind of like work backwards from there? I'm just saying in this formula right here. Let's say if I want to net 500,000 from this, could I put that in there?
Well, yeah, like for example, okay, if you wanted to net 500,000, then the simple way would be pretty much just to start adjusting your discount rate. So if we go to a 5% discount rate, that doesn't quite get us there. We go to a 3%, gets us closer. 2% gets us even closer. 1%, okay, gets us there. 1.15, and so forth, so on. You can play the high-low game until you get precisely right there at whatever 500,000 or whatever it is that you want to walk away with. But now, what that's saying in this case is that you've set your hurdle rate at this ridiculously low level, okay, in order to achieve that. Because here's why the hurdle rate matters. It's not just that you want to pay yourself back. You probably may also want to pay back some, it's not the mortgage, but you may want to pay back, once again, you know, from a kind of an investment perspective, you're wanting to pay back yourself an appropriate rate of return commensurate with all the risk that you've undertaken. And then, once again, you're sort of satisfied with that percentage, and then whatever else you make, cash money on top of that, it's gravy, is what you're really saying.
You need to have a bigger rate return than the discount rate. Like, okay, I'm looking for 15%, but with 10% I'm fine. Something like that.
Yeah. Like I said, for every person, every institution, every investor, it's different. You're going to find, like for example, nonprofits. They're going to do a pro forma on something, and their whole thing is as long as it breaks even, that's all that really matters. There's not really any sort of rate of return that they're really seeking. Okay. Whereas with an individual, you may simply say, I've got to earn 10% on my money every year or I'm not going to be happy. Whereas you might say, I've got to earn 15% of my money every year and I'm not going to be happy. Or you may say 20%. Or you may go to an institutional player and they may say, we're happy with 11%. Or you may go to somebody else. I mean, it's just, it's not an absolute number. This is why, in many cases, that with all the different players that you have in the marketplace, certain players automatically get priced out of the market because they are not able to, number one, access as cheap of a source of capital as somebody else, and number two, be able to deliver a particular return to their investors. And so, for example, I mean, the perfect scenario is you have found an incredibly low cost of borrowing from whatever lender or source of capital is out there, and you have found an angel set of investors that have no desire for any sort of rate of return on their investment whatsoever. That is nirvana. That is the perfect sort of scenario, because that pretty much means you can invest in almost anything and pay almost any price for a property, pay a higher price than everybody else in the market. But the naked reality is that maybe you as an individual, you're only able to borrow money at 6%, whereas those folks are able to borrow money at 3%. That automatically prices you out of the market for that particular product type. That is why also that when you look at a lot of the major players, they're focused on larger properties, larger deals, because for them, the brain damage of going through the due diligence process for a big property is really almost the same as it is the brain damage for a smaller property. And they've got a lot more cost that they've got, a lot more overhead that they've got to cover, you know, with that due diligence for those larger properties. That's why they're pretty much limited to the larger properties. Whereas a smaller player can maybe get around not having to maybe do all that same sort of due diligence and may be able to find a market niche of buying, you know, mid-size apartments or, you know, office buildings or, you know, whatever it might be, and still compete because they're chasing a much different type of deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, other questions? Good question, Dan. Did I answer? Nothing else? By the way, this doesn't mean you're going to go early, so don't get that in the back of your mind. There's some other stuff I can talk about. So, other questions that you've got?
Can you give us an example of how you would put together your discount rate? You know, like with just investors, like just hypothetical.
Yes, I can do that. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So the question was, how do you basically come up with a discount rate? The way that I tend to think about this is very similar to, how many of you, by the way, undergrads in finance? You know at least one or two of you, okay, so one. All right. So you remember something in finance called WACC. Weighted average cost of capital. You remember that, Robert? RJ?
Yeah, I remember the acronym. I didn't remember what it stood for.
That's all you remember.
Yeah.
Okay. Weighted average cost of capital. What does that sort of imply? That means that you've got more than one source of capital. Yes? Okay, for a traditional real estate deal, we've got at least two sources of capital at a minimum. We've got debt and we've got equity. Yes? Debt is what we borrow from the bank, equity is what we get from investors. Yes? Okay? Now we may have additional sources of capital coming from mezzanine financing or coming from, you know, alternative sources, but let's just start with the debt and equity part. Okay? So what you're going to find is this sort of weighted average cost of capital as we said, are going to have two sides to it. The debt side and the equity side. And on the debt side, first of all, the first question that we need to address is what is going to be our capital structure. Now what I mean by that, in terms of what is going to be our capital structure, that means, in other words, what's going to be basically our loan-to-value ratio, okay? In other words, what percentage are we going to borrow? What percentage are we going to invest ourselves in a form of equity? That's our capital structure. Also, could be called the debt stack, equity stack, you know, there's a whole number of terms that potentially sort of relate to that. But capital structure is the normal. So in this case, one of the things that we talked about earlier today in the other class was a lender and how much they might lend you in terms of a percentage. We talked about loan-to-value ratios. Okay? Well, if on the debt side, they're willing to loan you a loan-to-value ratio of 80%, then that means you have to come up with what percent equity? 20. So basically, the percent equity, if you will, going to be 20%. Everybody still with me? All right. Now, is this starting to look familiar, RJ?
Yeah.
Okay. So what am I going to fill in here with the remaining two blanks? My cost of debt and my cost of equity. Okay? So my cost of debt is, let's say, on an after-tax basis, my after-tax cost of debt might be 5%. Okay? Whereas my cost of equity, or I might actually refer to it as my return on equity, this is my hurdle rate with respect to just the equity piece. Okay? And so that might be, I don't know, 15%. Okay? Join with me so far? Yes or no? Okay? So, what that means is to get this weighted average cost of capital, we've got to do this math. We're basically saying that 80% of the project is being financed with a cost of 5% debt. The remaining 20% of the project is being financed with a 15% cost of equity. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes or no? Now, once again, if you just think about this without actually doing the math, my overall weighted average cost of capital is going to be what? Higher than 5%, lower than 15%. Yes? It's got to be. Okay, you follow what I'm saying? In other words, at the high end, we've got 15%. At the low end, we've got 5%. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, which side do you think it's going to be more skewed to?
5%.
5%, because it represents 80% of the capital structure. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's do the math. So our weighted average cost of capital is 7%. Okay? Now, to get to Jarvis's question. Basically what this is saying is if this is the capital structure that we have put together on a real estate deal, where that's our cost of debt and that's our return on equity, our required return on equity, then what we're saying is our minimum hurdle rate would need to be 7% or higher in order to pay everybody back and break even. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be purely satisfied completely with just that 7% weighted average cost of capital. It means that we've broken even. If we want, obviously, we're not going to be satisfied with anything less than that because we're basically going to be losing money. So it needs to be something north of that for us to be happy. Now, how much more north of that? You know, that's for you to sort of determine. But at the minimum, that would have to be your sort of threshold. Did I answer the question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what about the rest of you? Justin, thoughts? Okay. I mean, does it make sense to everybody or not? Okay. Now, as I said, you can complicate it up quite a bit in terms of adding other sources of capital in the mix. For example, one of the things that you've heard me mention was mezz financing. Okay? Mezzanine financing, mezz finance. If you don't believe me, Google it, okay? Mezzanine financing is kind of a middle ground financing. It's maybe not quite equity, not quite debt. It's basically kind of a hybrid sort of thing. In finance terms, it's kind of like preferred stock.
Okay.
Now, the idea behind mezzanine financing is, it's also another term for it, gap financing. Okay, it would be another term. Because what it potentially does is, like, for example, the lender tells you they require a loan-to-value ratio of 80%, meaning you've got to come up with 20% equity. But you're saying, I don't have 20% equity. Where am I going to get 20% equity? Where am I going to get that money? Friends, family, you know, whatever. Well, with mezzanine financing, what it would mean is you can go out, find an alternative source of financing that's not a traditional lender, that's going to be looking for probably a higher rate of return than this, but maybe lower than that. And so what you might be able to do is you, as the developer, you might only have to put in, let's say, 5%. So if you got 5% of your own money, 15% of mezzanine finance money, and then 80% of traditional lender money, that might be your structure. Does that make sense?
So basically, if it's like an 80% LTV and you can only come up with 10%, you would go to the mezzanine financer to get the other 10?
Precisely.
What is like a real world company that is a mezzanine?
It's not like, there's a whole bunch, but they're all like boutique-y, I guess would be the right, you know, I mean, they're all very, a lot of it is high net worth individuals.
Yeah.
They just simply put literally a shingle out there. In many cases, it may even be managed by their CPA. In other instances, there are mezzanine players that do specialize specifically in a particular product type, a particular market, and actually can provide expertise, you know, about that particular type of product, almost like a venture capital sort of approach. But yeah, you can, once again, you can pretty much just Google mezzanine finance and you'll like pull up a whole laundry list of folks, most of which you've never heard of.
So why, in this instance, instead of having to pay back the mezzanine financing company and the bank, for instance, I guess, why wouldn't you just do a 90% LTV loan to a bank?
Oh my God, I love that question. All right. The lenders are usually constrained by their board of directors as to what percentage they can loan out as a loan to value.
Right.
Okay? And the reason for that is because it's a risk thing.
Right.
And lenders, traditional lenders, are pretty risk adverse with respect to kind of their lending policies. And so basically, with an 80% loan to value ratio, they're sort of saying, all right, bad things could happen in the market, the property could go down by 20% in value, and we're not going to be hurt. We're still going to be able to cash out of the property and hopefully not lose any money as a traditional lender, okay? But if we raise that threshold from, let's say, 80 to 90%, the market goes down by a little bit, there's a greater chance that they're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
They're simply they're not willing to take on that risk, especially for the really low interest rate that they're potentially charging you. Now, what could happen with some lenders is that they would do a blended rate. And they would basically say, all right, we are going to offer you the first 80% at 5%, but then that next 10% or 15%, we're going to offer to you at a much higher interest rate because we are concerned that if the property does default, that is going to be a loss.
So who would be, like, say in that instance where you're splitting that 20% with the mezzanine financer, say everything goes underwater, now is that mezzanine, they're also liable?
You're going to be hurt first,
right,
as the equity player.
Yeah.
Then the next in line is going to be the mezz player,
Okay.
followed by then the senior debt.
Okay. And now for that reason, do mezzanine financiers charge a higher interest rate than a bank? Because they're liable?
Absolutely.
Okay. Makes sense.
And that's the whole kind of point of this is that, and we're getting into this within the next week or so in the finance class, but whenever lenders are pricing debt, you know, they're looking at all these different sort of characteristics, not just of the borrower, but of the tenants, you know, behind those borrowers, and, you know, saying, what is the likelihood of default? What is the likelihood that, you know, for whatever reason, that we would ever end up with this property again and then trying to sort of price that into the debt. But, you know, what actually sort of takes place is you're going to see something almost like this, that if this is our overall loan-to-value sort of ratio of sorts, and you're probably going to see, let's say, our cost of borrowing, oops, actually that's not right, cost of borrowing over here. And do loan-to-value over here. Okay, so maybe up to, let's say, a 50% loan-to-value ratio, we're willing to give you a 5% interest rate. And then let's say that all of a sudden, you decide to go up to a 6% level, okay, cost of borrowing, and that is ultimately going to be maybe taking it to, I don't know, let's just say 70% loan-to-value. Okay, but then all of a sudden you go beyond, let's say 70%, and it may go up dramatically more because more risk. And then as you really approach 100%, it goes up even higher. So in other words, let's say that's sort of 70, maybe this is 80% loan to value, and this over here is pretty darn close to 100% loan to value. So while that's maybe 5 or 6, this might be, I don't know, 8 or 9, and this up here might be 15%. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That the general thought process from the lender's perspective is up to 50%, we're not going to lose anything. You know, if the property goes bankrupt or, you know, closes down, the market falls apart, we can certainly sell it for 50% of the original value of the property.
Mm-hmm.
But as we sort of incrementally start going up with higher and higher sort of loan to value ratios, then we've got to factor in an additional risk premium in terms of the interest rate or the rate of return that we're going to generate. And it's not necessarily going to be the case that we're even talking about traditional lenders. There are so many different sources of capital out there for real estate.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously one of the newest entrants over the past few years is crowdfunding.
Yeah.
You know, you can hop online, put together a proposal, you know, pop it up on the internet, and potentially get all sorts of folks from all over the country, all over the world investing in your real estate deal,
Yeah.
okay, for better or for worse.
I almost worked for a mezzanine financer where they did this exact same thing, but except for paying whatever that 10%, they found like, they split their 10% in half, and essentially they found like government funding.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it.
Yeah.
And structure
Pretty
it.
smart. But.
Okay. All right, other questions? Great question. I did answer it, yes?
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. Could mezzanine financiers, are they limited to just, I guess in this instance, mortgages? Like, for instance, like if you had one property and you were 90% paid off and you wanted to buy another property.
Oh my God, yes, this is good stuff. Okay.
Could you then go to the mezzanine financer
Yeah.
to pay off your previous?
Yep, or you can do what is called a cross-collateralization loan.
Yeah.
Now, these are fascinating situations of where, let's say that you own multiple properties, okay? And then one of the first instances I ever saw with this was back in Dallas several years ago. You had one of the Dallas Cowboys who owned a whole set of Burger King franchises, okay? And so he had all of these Burger King franchises cross-collateralized.
Yeah.
And so let's say that he had 20 Burger King franchises, all right? Well, as you can expect, not all franchises perform equally. You know, one is absolutely stellar. Another, not so much, not making any money, losing money, okay? Well, with cross-collateralization, what you do is you basically say, I'm going to pledge all 20 of my franchises in tandem to secure a real estate loan, okay? And the idea is that hopefully all 20 will be able to support the level of debt that you're taking on for those properties. But if you were to do each one individually, the lender would view that as being more risky.
Yeah.
Because if they're singularly financed, then they've got to look very close at the operating performance of every single one with a fine-tooth comb and sort of say, well, this one on this part of town is not doing all that great, or not expected to do all that great. This one over here is doing really well. But by blending them all together, the lender is basically saying, okay, yeah, we're going to allow this cross-collateralization, and we're maybe going to give you a lower interest rate because of that cross-collateralization.
Yeah.
But the downside is if several of those Burger Kings start to blow up in the sense of not do well in their performance, then you could have a situation of where a handful of them could bring down the whole empire all at once. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, you can get some real benefits as a borrower for having that cross-collateralization, but in the event that, once again, several of them do blow up, then you're left with, you know, a much bigger problem of your whole empire goes down.
Is there a rule of thumb when doing that, when you cross collateral, right? Like, can I, like, if I have those Burger Kings, right?
Yep.
And let's say I go look for a property, am I looking for something with like similar returns, or are you trying to get one going at with it?
Well, normally, I mean, well, okay, let's put it this way. You can cross-collateralize anything.
Right.
I mean, it's like you can cross-collateralize an apartment complex with an office building, with a shopping center, with a whatever.
Right.
Now, as a general rule, if you're cross-collateralizing virtually the same asset, like I was talking with Burger King's, they're all the same product type, so the analysis is going to be virtually identical for each one. The operating performance metrics are going to be virtually identical for each one. Therefore, it's a fairly easy sort of analysis. But if you start cross-collateralizing assets that are very different from each other, then that's going to require probably a bit more due diligence on the part of the lender to investigate the backgrounds of each of those property types and to be able to more accurately come up with, you know, what the total portfolio value is and kind of what the metrics are for performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. Anybody else?
Just a general question. A residential loan is a
Yep.
mortgage. For
Yep.
commercial, is there another term for it? Is it still mortgage?
No, the difference is they're both mortgages. But the difference is in terms of the protection mechanisms that are in place. With residential mortgages, the government has put into place all sorts of safeguards to try to keep the average ordinary person from being taken advantage of by unscrupulous lenders, okay? And it doesn't always work, but they have tried to put in all these different sort of safeguards to try to ensure that that doesn't happen. Whereas with commercial mortgage, and there's also a lot more intervention in the residential mortgage market because the federal government has historically wanted to try to promote home ownership. And part of the idea there is that if people are homeowners, they're going to be more than likely to be invested in their communities and take care of their homes and all this other, you know, stability, yada, 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 okay? Well, on the commercial side of the business, there's never been that level of engagement by the government with respect to oversight and control.
Yeah.
And so with commercial loans, it's a whole different sort of process. I mean, it's in the sense that you're not having to inherently be worried about every little detail. It's a very much of a buyer beware kind of scenario with the borrowers. That the general idea is that they're going to be sophisticated players and that they're going to hopefully know what they're doing and not get themselves in trouble. But the reality is they may not be any more sophisticated than some of the residential borrowers, but yet the government treats them as if, okay, you're a business owner, you're a commercial property owner.
You're on your own.
You're on your own, kind of, that you don't have to invest in commercial property. The thought process is with the residential, you've got to have a place to live. And so therefore, there's a bit more of kind of the government sort of oversight with the residential property markets.
Makes sense.
I mean, Dustin, do you have any additional perspective on that? Okay. So, but with, I mean, you know, the other piece, that on the commercial side of the market, you know, the value is driven almost exclusively by the income from the property.
Yeah.
And then this is another thing to sort of think of. If you look at valuation for residential versus commercial, and you've got three approaches to value. You've got the cost approach, you've got the income approach, and you've got the sales comparison approach. Okay? The cost approach is based on what is the construction cost of the property that you're trying to set a value for. How much did it cost me to build that property plus my cost of land?
Yeah.
Okay? With the income approach, which is predominantly what's used for commercial properties, all the value is really derived from what are the rental revenues the property generates on an annual basis. Whereas the sales comparison approach, primarily used for residential, is all about finding a similar property. It's not income based at all. It's finding a similar property with similar attributes and saying, oh, it sold for $500,000 with 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a swimming pool in this neighborhood. So therefore, this property that has virtually the same identical characteristics, it's going to sell for $500,000 or should be valued at that.
Right.
And it's not driven by what it could rent out for on a monthly basis. It's not driven by necessarily how much it costs. It's driven by just simply what people are willing to pay based upon perceptions.
Is that the least accurate of all the valuation? Because I
don't
feel
know.
like you hear that when you're selling your house, for instance, and you just, maybe someone down the street has an open house, so you just go and see what the asking price is and base your...
Yeah, it's the most fraught with perception manipulation, because so much of the residential market is driven by emotion, driven by basically, you know, sort of how they feel about a property, okay? You know, how does it feel whenever they walk into it? How does it feel whenever you go out in the backyard? You know, and a lot of other attributes that are more, you know, kind of qualitative. You know, what sort of school district is it in? What sort of neighborhood? And what's the crime statistics? What are, you know, what does the landscaping look like? You know, is there a homeowners association? And all this other tangential stuff that really has nothing to do with, once again, how much it might generate in rental income on the open market.
Right.
Whereas on the commercial side, it's totally without emotion, totally without, you know, any sort of you know, sort of that same type of perception. Well, it's different. I mean, it's all driven by the numbers. You know, now, I mean, there sure are a few kind of exceptions, like with office properties, that, you know, you get a tenant that wants to be located in the nicest office space to present an image and that sort of thing. But, you know, barring, you know, that sort of thing, it's very much of a numbers-driven sort of valuation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas the cost approach, anybody have any idea what the cost approach would probably be most relevant for?
Something that's irregular.
Like new
Yeah,
construction?
something unusual. A lot of times, like government uses, schools, city halls, churches, that sort of thing, where there's not necessarily a revenue stream associated with it and not really a lot of sales comparables. It's just kind of like, okay, it costs that much, okay, that's how much it's worth, sort of thing.
They're not trying to make money off it.
Right. Now, this next sort of insight as it relates to these three approaches, I think is really valuable, because which one of these would you say is historical? Sales comparison. Because what are you doing? You're looking at historical past information, yes? Which one is future looking?
Income?
Absolutely. Because you're basically trying to predict what the income stream for a commercial property is going to be. And then, whereas the cost approach, to a certain extent, is the present. Okay?
Is there an approach that combines them all somehow?
Well, no, what you do is you basically come up with a value estimate for each of the three approaches, and then you do what's called a reconciliation process, which is, in essence, to try to place maybe a bit more weight on the one that's probably most directly relevant to the property type, but still take into consideration information from the other approaches.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Go for it.
I have one more. I guess it's a little bit off topic. I've just heard the term bridge loan be thrown around, I guess, in real estate.
Yep.
What is a bridge loan?
Pretty much, I mean, it's kind of gap financing. It's sort of, it's not quite mezzanine, but it's sort of to take you maybe from the construction loan into a permanent loan in some cases. Because, okay, normally you have a situation of where whenever you are, as a developer, you are building a property and you obtain a construction loan, all right? And that construction loan, as a general rule, is going to be kind of, in many cases, an interest-only loan. You're not actually paying back the principal, you're just simply paying interest payments while the construction process ensues. And in some cases, you may not even have to do that. In some cases, you know, depending on your credit, you may not have to be able to pay a lump sum kind of at the end once the construction is done or close to being done. Okay, there's a variety of different ways it can be structured. Okay, usually your construction lender is not the same as your permanent lender. Permanent lender is the lender that gives you a mortgage. Okay, because think about it. The lender that you have with a construction loan, they're much more involved with, they're coming out, they're doing site visits and site inspections. They're seeing that the work has been done. They're seeing that a slab has been poured, that, you know, plumbing has been put in, that the electrical's being done, that their permits are being pulled, that everybody's, you know, that everything is progressing as it should. Okay, it's a much more intensive sort of oversight process by the construction lender. And usually the construction lender is going to be a local lender that, because of that, they're going to be much more involved in the day-to-day kind of, you know, seeing what's going on. Now, what should happen is once your property gets to a certain level of completion, you should be able to get what is referred to as a takeout commitment, which is basically the construction lender saying, we want to ensure that there is a permanent lender out there waiting to basically fund this project, okay? And that we're not going to be left hanging at the end of this, you know, with having funded all the construction and there not be a permanent lender willing to actually lend you on the property, because that would be utter disaster for both the construction lender and for the borrower, because the construction lender is probably going to charge you a much higher interest rate than the permanent lender is going to charge you.
I'm just confused. Why would you go to another lender? Are you saying the construction loan lender doesn't incorporate
In some
the
cases,
time after?
they don't do the permanent lending, or their cost affiliated with doing permanent lending may not be as competitive as other players that are out there and available in the market.
Okay.
You may find a national permanent lender that is willing to offer you a much better deal structure all the way around than any of the local lenders might be able to achieve.
So let me get this straight. Construction loan is just a loan to physically build the building. The next one is for, takes into consideration the time until all units, I guess, are sold.
Pretty much. I mean,
Like the operating expenses that come with selling the property, essentially.
if we're talking about specifically a loan for, let's say, a shopping center, an office building, or multifamily residential, okay, then the normal thing is you're going to get a construction loan. Sometimes at the same time you get the construction loan, maybe sometime thereafter, a takeout commitment is going to be required by the construction lender to prove but you've got a permanent lender waiting for you at the end of the construction period, once you've achieved, maybe, the metrics are all a little bit different. In some cases, it's once your certificate of occupancy has been achieved. It could also be based upon a certain percentage of the units have been leased. It could also be, some other metric that is required by the permanent lender in order to take out the construction lender out of the deal.
Okay.
But what happens in a number of cases is that whatever that threshold might be, like for example, the threshold could very well be, you've got to be 75% pre-leased before the permanent lender will step in and take out the construction lender. Because the permanent lender doesn't want to get stuck with a property that's only, let's say, 30% pre-leased. Because they're saying, we don't want to be in a situation of where you're not going to be able to pay your mortgage payment.
Yep.
So therefore, we're going to require 75% pre-leasing or some other metric that they come up with as the sort of takeout commitment. Yep.
What about collateral guarantees for construction loans?
Yeah. I mean, the typical approach is if you can bring the land into the deal free and clear, then that's usually sufficient to be the collateral for the construction lender, because they can sort of say, okay, look, you get midway through this construction mess or whatever happens, we've got the land that we can basically take possession of in the event of a default for whatever reason. And so that has traditionally been kind of the collateral that gets sort of built into it. So it's usually not going to be the case that you're going to be able to come in and finance the land and get a construction loan on top of that, unless you've got maybe, like for example, let's assume that I own the land free and clear. You come to me as a developer and say, okay, I want to partner with you, you own the land free and clear, we're going to get this construction loan, we're going to use your land as collateral, and in return, any and all income associated with the property once it's complete is going to flow back to me first, and then once I'm fully paid and satisfied, then you potentially would be able to capture whatever return.
And would a construction loan lender be okay putting out a construction loan that's the value's a lot higher than this, the land might be worth?
And that's, once again, it's going to be totally dependent, on just how valuable really that land is. That, like for example, if the land is worth 20% of the overall project value, that may be sufficient for the lender to sort of say, okay, that's your equity, in terms of for the construction loan and for the permanent loan for that matter, okay? But, maybe if now Florida it's a little bit different because usually land value is a pretty high percentage of the overall project value, relative to, other parts of the country where it may only be 10% or 5%. But, here, it's probably not uncommon, for 30 or so percent of the value of the property to be tied up with the land cost.
That makes sense.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Are we doing on time? We good. Okay. All right. So 30 more minutes of questions and then 30 minutes for the quiz. So, questions? Nobody?
Okay, let's say in this example right here, right? Where you have the land and let's say you don't own it all the way out, but you don't have like traditional financing on the land.
Okay.
Like let's say if the land seller finance or something like that, right?
Yep.
Do the construction lenders, do they look at that as regular financing? Like how do they look at that financing?
So the question, if I'm understanding it, is what if you have engaged in like a contract for deed or some other sort of seller financing sort of situation, and how is a lender potentially going to look at that? I mean, as long as everything has been recorded and everybody sort of, everything is sort of an arm's length transaction, everybody sort of understands what's going on, an independent, valuation of the land has been made and that sort of thing, there shouldn't be a problem.
Okay,
I mean,
not look at it as regular financing.
well, I mean, if it's fairly straightforward, the lender's probably not going to have a problem with it. But if there's some and I can't just off the top of my head just think of something, you know, really wacky and strange, but to the point that it is, that could pose a problem with the lender being comfortable with it in terms of providing the permanent financing, or for that matter, the construction loan. But it's not uncommon at all for many developers to partner with the landowners in order to make a deal happen. Because in many cases, the landowner might just simply be, you know, an individual, family, whatever, that's owned land for forever and a day, and they're not real estate developers. They don't have any sort of skill sets as it relates to that. And so they're perfectly happy sort of saying, okay, this person's coming along and telling us, we're gonna do this and this and this with your property, and potentially here's this big pile of money that you're gonna have at the end of all of this. And that may be sufficient.
So what's their promise? The building or the property itself after a certain amount of years, right?
But I'm sorry, what?
Like from a developer standpoint, coming to a family that owns the land, right? Like pretty much you're leaving the building to them after a certain amount of years.
Not necessarily, but once again, that depends on the deal structure. You could have it, once again, set up to where at a certain point in time, you agree to a buyout of the actual underlying land. Or you could just do a long-term land lease. You know, and it's not uncommon, you know, in a lot of places to simply say, okay, like a lot of government institutions and universities do this all the time, especially with like apartment communities that like universities say, okay, we want a new dorm built. Well, they will, in essence, say, okay, we're not going to sell you the land, but we'll do a 30-year ground lease on the land, and then ultimately over that 30 years, the developer makes payments to the university for that ground lease, and then maybe at the end of the ground lease, then yeah, the university walks away with the property. So there's so many different ways to structure. So many different ways. Okay? All right. Any other questions? I mean, we've covered a lot of different random things here, but I love the questions. Okay. Nothing else.
At some point in the class, I'd like to maybe try some modeling on some construction loans, just.
We're on week 5 or 6, that's what we're doing.
I'll be waiting with anticipation. Great anticipation.
Yep, it's, week 4, actually. Okay, all right, well, if there's nothing else, you guys are refusing to ask questions.
I guess I can ask, like, what safeguards are in place or regulations to control, like, foreign investment, foreign investors, and for you not to get caught up with shady foreign investors?
That is a very multi-part question, with a multi-part answer. One of the things that recently has been, you know, a very big issue, especially in Miami, you know, has been international investors, all cash investors, you know, buying up predominantly high-end townhomes, condos, that sort of thing, you know.
Panama Papers,
Whatever, yeah. And as a means of effectively money laundering or whatever it might be with those particular. So yeah, there's an issue there that is potentially problematic. But in terms of, you know, there's also kind of on the positive side, there's the EB-5, isn't that what it's called? If you can invest in real estate, I think it's $500,000, and you can create so many jobs. In essence, it's a pathway to citizenship. Okay, I think is it EB-5? Okay. And, you know, so that, you know, is a whole different, you know, sort of very positive sort of, you know, view of international investment, of trying to get people from, you know, a variety of countries to come in, you know, as I said, buy real estate, set up real estate, you know, develop it, create jobs, and then ultimately, as I said, get a path to citizenship.
and they get vetted, right?
Right. So, you know, those are two, you know, sort of big ones, but I don't know that we've ever really had, that I can recall, I mean, that big of an issue with like international investors as a whole coming in, buying property within the U.S. I mean, you know, sometimes folks don't inherently like it, but to my knowledge, there haven't been just a lot of huge barriers to it by comparison to other countries, where there's a bit more concern that you're going to have, that if you don't have a local partner, they're not going to allow you to invest in real estate within that country, because they're afraid that it's going to be bought up by a lot of international investors and then somehow displace the locals in some way. But hopefully answers a little bit. All right, well, instead of torturing you anymore, all right, let's go ahead and take a look and see if we can do a little quiz. Okay, once again, you're going to need your little spreadsheet that you created.
On this quiz, are you going to take off points, say if like negative, if it's instead of saying negative, positive, that sort of thing?
No, as long as it's the right number,
Cool.
that's all I'm really concerned with. You know.
Cool with me.
So here's what it is. Just to kind of, I'll walk you through real quick so there's no questions. It's 12 questions all in all. There are a couple of potential sort of answered questions. Every single answer is a number, okay? So it's either it's right or it's wrong, okay? There's no in between. It's very binary in that respect. Now, if you did the spreadsheets as we did, and you checked everything, you should be able to finish this thing pretty quickly. Make sure you do read every single question carefully. Most of them, and people who've had me before know this, most of my questions are pretty straightforward. But then I purposely put in a couple of questions that tend to sort of separate the people who kind of sort of know it from the people who really know it, okay? So, in other words, how do I distinguish between an A and a B and a C, okay? All right, so just keep that in mind as you're sort of working through this. It should be very straightforward. I don't think there's anything particularly, you know, problematic with it. But yeah, all you need is the spreadsheet, and you're not to use your calculator for this. You're meant to use only the spreadsheet that you created. Okay, is that clear? Okay, here it comes.
I want to have a quiz every day, just like in the other class.
Probably.
Now, are these quizzes the entirety of our grade this semester?
Along with the spreadsheet creation, but yeah.
No pressure. I think we need one or two more down here. 3 more. Yeah, go and pay now.
Wait till I get back.
Can I use the calculator too to compare?
Nope, just spreadsheet.
You can say. Right? Thank you, Paul.